The city of Seoul, a sprawling tapestry of neon and shadow, lay beneath a relentless winter rain that slicked the asphalt like spilled ink. High above the bustling streets, in a penthouse that felt more like a mausoleum of glass and steel than a home, Junho adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit. He was a man etched in grayscale, his existence defined by the sharp lines of authority and the cold calculus of the underworld. As the head of the Cheonil Syndicate, Junho commanded armies of men, shifted market trends with a whisper, and possessed wealth that could buy entire city blocks. Yet, as he stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window, the man looking back was ghost-like, a hollow vessel adorned in expensive armor. The silence of the apartment was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air from his lungs. Tonight, the solitude was unbearable. It was the anniversary of the day he had chosen power over family, a date that always gnawed at the edges of his sanity. He needed noise. He needed life. He needed to be where the people were, even if he could never truly be one of them. Junho descended into the city, his black sedan cutting through the traffic like a shark through water. He dismissed his driver and bodyguards at the corner, an uncharacteristic risk born of a desperate need to feel human, even for an hour. He walked toward the Golden Hearth, a legendary establishment known not for its exclusivity, but for its warmth, a place where steam rose from charcoal grills and laughter bounced off wooden beams. The air smelled of roasting garlic and caramelized meat, a sensory assault that made Junho's stomach turn with a hunger that wasn't just physical. He stepped into the foyer, the humidity fogging his rimless glasses. The hostess, a young woman harried by the Friday night rush, barely looked up from her ledger. When she finally did, she saw only a solitary man in a suit too sharp for the casual setting, his face a mask of impenetrable stoicism. She did not see a kingpin. She saw a disruption to her seating chart. "Table for one?" she asked, her voice clipped, scanning the packed room where families shouted and lovers clinked glasses. "I'm sorry, sir. We are at capacity for tables. We don't seat singles at the grills during peak hours. Perhaps the bar across the street." The rejection was mundane, bureaucratic, and utterly devastating. It stripped him of his title and left him as he truly was, a man who had everything, yet had no one to break bread with. He stood frozen, the humiliation burning hotter than anger, the golden light of the dining room feeling miles away, a paradise barred by his own isolation. He turned to leave, his hand gripping the cold brass handle of the door, ready to retreat back into the rain and the safety of his sterile world. The shame was a bitter pill, tasting of ash. He had not told himself it was loneliness. He had called it discipline. But the lie crumbled here, in the entryway. Just as he pushed the door open, a voice cut through the din. Not loud, but possessing a distinct, melodic clarity that anchored the chaotic room. "Excuse me, sir." Junho paused, his instincts flaring, hand twitching toward the concealed weapon beneath his jacket. He turned slowly. It was not a threat. It was a woman seated at a cramped table near the window. She was African, her skin glowing with a radiance that defied the dreary weather outside, her hair braided intricately against her scalp. She waved a hand, not with the manic energy of a fan or the seduction of a courtesan, but with the casual familiarity of a neighbor. This was Amara. At 28, she carried herself with a grace that suggested she had walked through fires and come out carrying water for others. She wore a simple, slightly worn yellow sweater that seemed to hold all the light in the room. Beside her sat a young girl, no older than 6, with wide, observing eyes that seemed to dissect Junho's soul in a single glance. Amara gestured to the empty chair opposite her, a chair piled with a coat and a child's backpack. "There's no need to go back out in that," Amara called out, ignoring the confused look of the hostess. "We have space. The grill is hot enough for 3-inch." The absurdity of the offer struck Junho silent. In his world, no one offered anything without a contract, a debt, or a threat. Kindness was a currency he had stopped trading in decades ago. He looked at the hostess, who shrugged, relieved to not have to deal with the awkward standing man. He looked back at Amara. Her smile was not a polite grimace. It was an open door. For the first time in 20 years, Junho did not calculate the risk. He simply let go of the door handle and walked toward the warmth. Sliding into the booth felt like crossing a border into a foreign country. The table was small, forcing a physical proximity that made Junho's pulse hammer against his ribs. The heat from the charcoal grill in the center of the table flushed his cheeks, or perhaps it was the unfamiliar sensation of being seen. Amara moved the clutter with efficient, unapologetic movements. "I'm Amara," she said, her voice rich and rhythmic, carrying the lilt of her heritage mixed with the clipped efficiency of soul life. "And this is Simi, the little girl." Simi did not smile immediately. She studied Junho with the terrifying intensity of a child who knows the world is not always safe. She held a plastic fork like a scepter. Junho stiffened, his hands resting on his knees under the table, hidden. "June," he lied, shortening his name, stripping it of the honorifics and terror attached to it. "I am June." "Well, June, you look like you were about to fight the rain, and the rain always wins." Amara laughed, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the wooden table. She didn't ask why he was alone. She didn't ask about the suit that cost more than her car. She simply used a pair of tongs to flip a strip of galbi on the grill, the meat sizzling violently. "You eat meat? Or are you a vegetarian who wandered into the wrong place?" The playfulness disarmed him. He found himself nodding, mute. She placed a piece of cooked beef onto a small plate and pushed it toward him. It was a gesture of such primal, maternal care that Junho felt a lump form in his throat. He picked up his chopsticks, the metal feeling heavy. He took a bite. It was just beef, marinade, and fire, but to Junho, it tasted like a memory of a life he had never lived. He looked at Amara, watching the steam curl around her face, softening her features. She wasn't intimidated by his silence. She filled it with a comfortable presence, attending to her daughter, wiping a smudge of sauce from Simi's cheek with a tenderness that made Junho's heart ache with a specific, sharp yearning. He realized then that he was sitting with a queen, though her kingdom was merely this booth and the little girl beside her. As the meal progressed, the armored layers of Junho's persona began to chip away, not from force, but from the relentless, gentle erosion of normalcy. The soja bottle was opened and shared, the sharp liquid warming his chest. Simi, having decided he was not a monster, finally spoke. "Do you have a little girl?" she asked, her voice high and demanding. Amara hushed her gently. "Simi, eat your rice." But she didn't stop the question.
Juno frose.
He thought of the abortions he had paid for, the relationships he had severed to keep his enemies from having leverage. "No," he said, his voice rasping. "I have work." "Lots of work," Simi nodded sagely, as if this explained everything. "My mommy works too. She cleans the big building with the blue lights. She says her hands hurt, but she still braids my hair." Junho looked at Amara's hands. They were beautiful, strong, but the skin was dry, the knuckles slightly swollen, and the nails were short and unpolished. They were hands that labored. He felt a sudden, fierce spike of protectiveness that startled him. He looked at his own hands, manicured, soft, stained only with invisible blood. "You work in the Azure Tower?" he asked. It was a building he owned.
He didn't say it.
Amara nodded, taking a sip of water. "Night shifts mostly. It allows me to take Simi to school." She didn't complain. She stated it as a fact of survival. There was a dignity in her struggle that made his own triumphs feel cheap. He found himself leaning in, asking her about her life, her journey from Nigeria to Korea, the difficulties of raising a child alone in a homogeneous society. She spoke of prejudice and hardship not with bitterness, but with the resilience of someone who knows her own worth. As she spoke, her eyes locked with his, and in the golden haze of the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just charity, it was chemistry. A spark of attraction, raw and undeniable, arced between the tired single mother and the lonely kingpin. For a moment, the restaurant faded, and he was just a man captivated by a woman's strength. The climax of the evening approached not with a bang, but with the arrival of the bill. The waiter placed the small leather folder on the table. Amara wiped her hands on a napkin, her expression shifting from laughter to a momentary, calculated stress. She reached for her purse, a worn bag with a fraying strap, and began to count out bills. Junho saw the hesitation, the mental math she was doing, sacrificing tomorrow's comfort for tonight's joy. The sight of her counting one, the crumpled currency of the working class, triggered a violent reflex in him. This was a problem he could solve. This was the one language he spoke fluently. He didn't just want to pay the bill. He wanted to crush the very concept of her struggle. "Stop," Junho said, his voice dropping back into the command register of the boss. He reached into his jacket and produced a black titanium card, heavy and cold. He didn't just place it on the bill. He placed it on top of her hand, covering her money. "I will take care of this." It wasn't an offer. It was a decree. Amara looked at the card, then up at his face. The warmth in her eyes cooled slightly. She saw the shift in him, the return of the mask. "June," she said softly, trying to push his hand back. "You were our guest. I invited you." "It is nothing to me," he said, and the words came out wrong. They sounded arrogant, dismissive of her sacrifice. He leaned forward, intent on fixing her life in the only way he knew how. "In fact," he continued, the transaction taking over his heart, "I can help you. The building you work in? I know people. I can get you a better position. I can pay for Simi's school. You don't need to count bills." He thought he was being a savior. He thought he was offering a lifeline. He did not realize he was stripping her of her agency, reducing their connection to a transaction where he was the benefactor and she was the charity case. He watched her face, expecting gratitude, but instead, he saw a wall go up, a wall built of pride and boundaries that no amount of money could breach. The air at the table grew thin, the romantic tension curdling into a conflict of worlds. He had shown her his power, but he had hidden his heart again. Amara stared at the black titanium card as if it were a weapon placed on the table, her expression cooling from the warmth of shared laughter to a rigid, dignified sorrow. She did not raise her voice, nor did she cause a scene that would draw the eyes of the bustling restaurant, but the air between them shifted instantly, freezing the camaraderie that had bloomed only moments before. She slowly reached out, her fingers rough from labor but steady in their resolve, and slid the heavy card back across the wooden table toward him. It made a harsh scraping sound against the grain, a noise that seemed to echo in the sudden cavern of silence between them. "June," she said, her voice dropping to a register that was firm and unyielding, "you have mistaken my hospitality for a plea." She picked up her own crumpled bills, smoothing out the corners of a 10,001 note with deliberate care. "I invited you because no one should eat alone in the rain. I did not invite you to audition for the role of my savior." Simi, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, stopped chewing, her large eyes darting between her mother's straightened spine and the man who had suddenly become a stranger again. Amara continued, her eyes searching his, looking for the man she had glimpsed behind the expensive suit. "Money is easy for you.
It is heavy for me, yes.
But it is mine. When you try to buy my struggles, you take away my victories. I am not a project to be fixed with a swipe of a card." She stood up, gathering Simi's backpack and coat with swift, fluid motions. The rejection was total. It wasn't just a refusal of funds. It was a rejection of his worldview. She placed her money on the table, the exact amount for her and Simi, leaving his portion unpaid, a final boundary drawn in the sand. "Thank you for the company, June. But I think we are finished here." She took Simi's hand, and the little girl looked back once, confused, before they disappeared into the rainy night, leaving Junho sitting with his black card and a pile of cold meat, the golden light of the restaurant suddenly feeling very, very dim. The drive back to the penthouse was a blur of neon streaks and suffocating silence. The interior of the sedan, usually a sanctuary of leather-scented quiet, now felt like a coffin. Junho sat in the back, the unread messages on his phone piling up, threats from rivals, reports on shipments, the endless chatter of an empire built on fear, but he could not bring himself to care. He stared out at the rain-streaked window, watching the city dissolve into gray tears. When he entered his apartment, the sensory deprivation was absolute. The climate control was set to a perfect, sterile 20 degrees. The lighting was a cool, architectural blue that highlighted the sharp angles of his imported furniture. It was a perfect life, and it was absolutely wretched. He walked to the kitchen island, pouring a glass of whiskey that cost more than Amara's monthly rent, but he couldn't drink it. He slammed the glass down, the amber liquid splashing over his hand. The sting of the alcohol against a small paper cut on his finger was the only thing that felt real. He looked around the vast, empty space. For years, he had told himself that this isolation was the cost of greatness, a noble sacrifice to keep the chaos of the world at bay. Now he saw it for what it was, a cage. He replayed the dinner over and over in his mind, dissecting his error. He had treated kindness as a transaction. He had assumed that because he had power, he had the right to dictate terms. He had offered her a golden cage to replace her struggle, not realizing that her struggle was the forge of her dignity. The hollow ache in his chest was not hunger. It was the realization that the boss had everything, yet the woman who cleaned his building had something he could not purchase, a soul that belonged to her and her alone. 3 days passed in a haze of distraction. Junho sat in boardrooms, his eyes glazed over as lieutenants discussed territory disputes in the Gangnam district. He signed death warrants and business deals with the same mechanical detachment. But on the 4th day, the paralysis broke. He found himself standing in the lobby of the Azure Tower at 3 a.m. The building was silent, a sleeping giant of glass and steel. He wasn't there to inspect the security or check the books. He was looking for a yellow sweater. He found the cleaning crew on the 14th floor, a team of women moving in rhythmic unison with mops and trash carts. He stayed in the shadows, watching. He saw her. Amara was there, pushing a heavy industrial polisher, her back bowed under the strain. She looked exhausted, stopping to stretch her spine, wincing slightly. But then, another woman said something, and Amara laughed, that same rich, resonant laugh that had anchored him in the restaurant. It was a sound of defiance against the drudgery. Junho stepped back into the elevator before he could be seen, his heart hammering. He realized he couldn't just walk up to her and apologize. Words were cheap, and money was offensive. He needed to speak a language she respected. He needed to speak in sweat and service. He did his research, not as a crime lord gathering intel on a target, but as a man seeking a map to redemption. He found out where she spent her Saturday mornings. It wasn't at a spa or a mall. It was at a dilapidated community center in the outskirts of the city, a place that provided daycare and meals for the children of foreign workers. On Saturday morning, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening snow. Junho arrived at the community center, but he did not arrive in his black sedan, and he did not wear his Italian wool suit. He wore a pair of nondescript work pants and a thick, generic parka he had bought from a street vendor. He parked his car blocks away and walked. The center was a crumbling brick building with peeling paint and a leaking roof. Inside, it was chaos, children running, volunteers shouting over the din, the smell of cheap cleaning solution fighting the smell of damp plaster. He saw Mara across the room, organizing a chaotic pile of donated winter coats. She looked harried, her braids tied back, Simi clinging to her leg while she tried to work. Junho didn't approach her. Instead, he found the center's director, an elderly man overwhelmed by a broken radiator. "I'm here to help," Junho said, his voice quiet. The old man pointed him toward the kitchen, where a mountain of dishes from the breakfast rush sat in stagnant water. Junho, the man who had severed fingers for insults, rolled up his sleeves. He plunged his hands into the greasy, lukewarm water. For 4 hours he scrubbed. He scrubbed until his manicured fingernails were ragged, until his back ached in a way the gym never made it ache. He moved crates of vegetables. He fixed the hinge on the back door that wouldn't close. He worked with a silent, ferocious intensity, sweating through his cheap clothes, his ego dissolving with every menial task. He was not the boss here. He was just a pair of hands. It was past noon when the noise in the main hall quieted down for nap time. Junho was on his knees, tightening a loose bolt on one of the small, battered tables in the reading corner. He was covered in dust, a smudge of grease across his forehead, his hair unkempt. He felt a presence behind him and turned. Amara was standing there, holding 2 paper cups of instant coffee. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked stunned. She stared at his ruined hands, then up to his face, stripping away the context of who she thought he was. She saw the sweat. She saw the lack of pretense. There were no bodyguards, no black cards, no grand gestures of saviorhood. Just a man fixing a table so a child wouldn't get hurt. You missed a spot, she whispered, a small, tentative smile touching her lips. It was a callback to their first meeting, a bridge being rebuilt. Junho stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his pants, feeling a vulnerability he hadn't felt in decades. The wrench was slippery, he replied, his voice hoarse. Amara stepped closer, the barrier of wealth and pride that had separated them dissolving in the dusty air of the center. She handed him the coffee. Their fingers brushed, the warmth of the cup transferring between them, a tactile connection that felt more electric than any business deal. Why? She asked simply. Because, Junho said, looking her in the eye, you were right. I don't know how to be a friend, but I am a fast learner, and I wanted to be where the warmth was. Weeks later, the winter began to recede, yielding to the fragile green of early spring. The golden hearth was busy again, the steam rising from the grills like incense offerings to the gods of hospitality. This time, there was no rain, and there was no waiting. Junho sat at the same table near the window, but the dynamic had shifted tectonically. He was not wearing a suit. He wore a soft cashmere sweater, sleeves pushed up, revealing a healing cut on his forearm from a renovation project. Amara sat across from him, radiant in a dress the color of terracotta. Simi was between them, happily dissecting a plate of grilled mushrooms, chattering endlessly about school. The conversation flowed like a river, natural and unforced. They didn't talk about his empire, which he was slowly, painfully divesting himself of, delegating the darkness to others so he could step into the light. They talked about Simi's reading list, about the leaking roof they had finally patched together, about the future. When the bill came, there was no battle for dominance. Amara placed her card on the tray. Junho started to reach for it, instinct flaring, but then he stopped. He looked at her. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their equality. He pulled his hand back and smiled, a genuine, eye-crinkling smile that transformed his stoic face. Next time is mine, he said. Deal, she replied. As they walked out into the crisp Seoul air, Junho took Simi's hand on one side, and Amara took the other. He was no longer the king of the underworld, isolated on his throne of ice. He was just a man walking a little girl to the car, tethered to the earth by love, finally having found the table where he belonged.